Although there have been many people who have lived great lives that will have a wonderful, lasting legacy, I believe that Susan B. Anthony and her efforts in the women's suffrage movement was one of the biggest. Susan B. Anthony is widely renowned for her work in the women's suffrage movement and women's rights movement. She never gave up and always persevered through all of the hardships that would occur. Because of her relentless effort and morale-boosting work, she paved the way to a new America that better represented a true democracy. Susan B. Anthony was born on February 15, 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. She was brought up in a Quaker family with long activist traditions. Early in her life, she developed a sense of justice and moral zeal. She was a teacher for 15 years until she got fed up with the sexist and segregated ways of America. She became active in the temperance movement, or the promotion of stricter alcohol laws, but because she was a woman, she wasn't allowed to speak at rallies and other events. Because of her experiences with this subject, she and her friend Elizabeth Stanton joined the women's rights movement in 1852. Shortly after this, she devoted her life to women's suffrage, demanding that women be given the right to vote. Anthony knew that women would never be able to be taken seriously if they were unable to vote in elections or take part in any important decisions. In 1866, Anthony and Stanton founded the American Equal Rights Association, and in 1868 they started publishing the newspaper The Revolution in Rochester. They would push the motto, "Men their rights and nothing more, women their rights and nothing less," with the aim of establishing justice for all. She received a massive amount of hate and protest, but never backed down or reciprocated to the hatred. Anthony and Stanton thought that the Republicans would support them for giving them the vote on the 13th Amendment that would abolish slavery in the USA. However, they became very unsatisfied when the Republicans did not. Abolition and women's rights or women's suffrage were considered in the same general category, but when the 15th Amendment passed stating that black men could vote in 1868, it left the women's petition completely out of the amendment. After the 15th Amendment passed, women suffragists really stepped up their game. They were ready for a revolution and felt it was needed to secure women's rights. In 1869, Anthony and Stanton founded the National Woman's Suffrage Association. Also in 1869, the suffrage movement split, with Anthony and Stanton's National Association continuing to campaign for a constitutional amendment, and the American Women's Suffrage Association adopting a strategy of getting the vote for women on a state-by-state basis. In the 1870s, Anthony campaigned intensely for women's suffrage on speaking tours in the West. Later, in 1872, in Rochester, New York, Anthony, three of her sisters, and other women were arrested for attempting to vote. She and the other women were arraigned. Anthony went to trial and declared, "My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, and my judicial rights are all alike ignored." The trial was very corrupt, and the judge instructed the jury to find her guilty. She was fined $100 but refused to pay. Luckily, her lawyer paid the fine. In 1877, she gathered petitions from 26 states with 10,000 signatures. Even with all of her work and the massive amounts of signatures, Congress pushed them off and didn't bother with them. Even then, Anthony persevered and appeared before every Congress from 1869 to 1906 to ask for the passage of the suffrage amendment. In 1887, both of the women's suffrage organizations, including the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, merged and became the National American Women's Suffrage Association, also known as NAWSA, with Stanton as president and Anthony as vice president. When Stanton retired in 1892, Anthony took over as president. Later, in the 1990s, she started campaigning in the West to make sure that the territories where women had the vote were not blocked from the admission to the Union. In 1900, at age 80, Anthony finally retired as president of NAWSA. She died in 1906 at her home on Madison Street in Rochester. Even after Anthony's death, the mother of the suffrage movement's work continued. Because of her perseverance and groundwork in women's suffrage, she paved the way for women getting to vote. The 19th Amendment, also called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was passed in 1920. An example of her legacy is still seen today. For example, my dad's first boss, a female attorney who graduated from Harvard Law School. Without Susan B. Anthony's efforts in women's suffrage, her amazing education and job as an attorney would not be possible. Another example of this would be Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court. Many other women have held important positions in our government as well, including governors, Secretary of States, Speaker of the House, and members of our Senate and House of Representatives. None of this would have been possible without Susan B. Anthony fighting for their rights in the women's suffrage movement. From all of her efforts, she gave around 50% of the American population the right to have say in their lives that they so deserved. And even though Susan B. Anthony never got to legally vote herself, her memory is preserved every time men and women go to the ballot box saying, "Voting